In today's video, we delve into the powerful story of the shattered trust, a story of a cheating wife and a family's journey to healing. Follow Ethan Harris, a dedicated radio host, as he navigates the heartbreak of discovering his wife's infidelity. Witness his struggles and triumphs as he rebuilds his life and finds hope amidst the pain. This emotional tale captures the essence of love, betrayal, and the resilience of the human spirit. Stay tuned as we explore this compelling narrative that resonates with anyone who has faced life's unexpected challenges. Ethan Harris leaned back in his chair, his eyes skimming over the latest political headlines on his laptop screen. As a nationally syndicated radio talk show host, he was used to the constant barrage of news, scandals, and controversies. But today, his mind wasn't on the latest political drama. His thoughts were elsewhere, at home, where his wife Sarah was likely buried in legal documents or on a conference call with yet another high-profile client. It hadn't always been this way. Ethan remembered when he and Sarah first moved into their New York apartment, excited about starting a life together. Sarah had just landed a prestigious job at a top law firm, and Ethan's radio show was beginning to gain traction. They were both ambitious, driven, and deeply in love. But somewhere along the way, their priorities shifted. Ethan sighed, closing his laptop. He glanced at the clock on the wall, 7:45 p.m. Sarah was supposed to be home over an hour ago. He knew better than to expect her to be on time, but tonight was different. Tonight was supposed to be their night, a rare evening where they had both agreed to leave work behind and spend time together, just the two of them and their son, Tommy. As Ethan walked over to the kitchen, he checked his phone for any missed calls or messages. Nothing. He opened the oven and peeked at the lasagna he had prepared earlier, still keeping warm. Cooking had become a therapeutic escape for him, a way to fill the void left by Sarah's constant absence. Tommy, their 3-year-old son, was playing quietly in the living room, his chubby fingers stacking colorful blocks into a precarious tower. Ethan smiled at the sight, his heart swelling with love and pride. Tommy was the best thing that had happened to him and Sarah, but even their son couldn't bridge the growing gap between them. The sound of a key turning in the lock pulled Ethan from his thoughts. The front door creaked open, and Sarah stepped in, her expression tired but determined. She was still dressed in her work clothes, a sleek, black pantsuit that exuded confidence and authority. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and her blue eyes, usually so vibrant, looked weary. "Hey," Ethan greeted her, trying to keep the disappointment out of his voice. "Hi," Sarah replied, setting her briefcase down by the door. "Sorry I'm late. The meeting ran over, and then I got caught up with some paperwork." "How was your day?" Ethan shrugged. Same old, same old. How about you?" "Busy," Sarah said, kicking off her heels and walking into the kitchen. She glanced at the lasagna in the oven and then at Ethan. "You made dinner?" "Yeah, I thought we could have a nice meal together, like we used to," Ethan said, his tone hopeful. Sarah smiled faintly, but Ethan could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "That sounds nice. Let me just freshen up a bit." As Sarah headed to the bathroom, Ethan's smile faded. He knew she was tired, but he also knew that their problems ran deeper than just a busy schedule. It was the endless late nights, the missed dinners, and the constant interruptions that had slowly eroded the foundation of their relationship. When Sarah returned, she had changed into more comfortable clothes, a pair of sweatpants and a loose t-shirt. She sat down at the table, and Ethan served the lasagna, placing a small portion on Tommy's plate as well. "Smells good," Sarah said, picking up her fork. "Thanks," Ethan replied, trying to gauge her mood. "So, how was work today?" Sarah took a bite of lasagna, chewing thoughtfully before answering. "It was fine. The usual stuff. We just took on a new client, Michael Carter, the politician who's been in the news lately. He's got some legal trouble, and we're representing him." Ethan's stomach tightened. He had heard of Michael Carter. He was a controversial figure, embroiled in multiple scandals, including allegations of corruption and fraud. Ethan had discussed Carter on his show more than once, and his listeners had strong opinions about him. "Michael Carter, huh?" Ethan said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "That's a big case." "Yeah, it is. Sarah admitted. It's going to be a lot of work, but it's a huge opportunity for the firm, and for me. Ethan nodded slowly, not sure how to respond. He understood the significance of the case, but he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled in his chest. He had hoped that after the last big case, Sarah would take a step back, maybe focus more on their family. But it seemed like she was diving headfirst into another demanding case. Just don't let it consume you, Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm. We've been through this before, Sarah. I don't want to lose you to your work again. Sarah looked up from her plate, her expression softening. Ethan, I know I've been caught up with work a lot, but I'm trying. I really am. I just need to get through this case, and then I'll take a break. I promise. Ethan wanted to believe her. He wanted to trust that things would get better, that they could find a way to reconnect. But he had heard similar promises before, and each time, the demands of her career had pulled her further away. I hope so, Ethan said quietly, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. I miss you, Sarah. I miss us. Sarah's eyes shimmered with emotion, and for a moment, Ethan thought he saw a glimpse of the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. But the moment passed, and she quickly masked her feelings behind a professional facade. I miss us too, Sarah whispered, her voice tinged with sadness. I'll make it right, Ethan. I will. They finished dinner in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavily in the air. Afterward, Ethan put Tommy to bed while Sarah retreated to her office to review some documents. As Ethan tucked his son in, he couldn't shake the feeling that their family was slipping through his fingers like sand. Ethan stood by Tommy's crib, watching his son sleep peacefully. He brushed a stray curl from Tommy's forehead and kissed him goodnight. As he left the room, he wondered how much longer he could hold on to the life he had once dreamed of. In the quiet of their apartment, Ethan felt a growing sense of isolation. He knew that their relationship was at a crossroads, and unless something changed, he feared that they would continue to drift apart until there was nothing left to salvage. Ethan walked into the living room and sat down on the couch, the emptiness of the room echoing his thoughts. He picked up the remote and turned on the TV, flipping through channels aimlessly. But no matter what was on the screen, his mind kept returning to Sarah and the distance that had grown between them. As the night wore on, Ethan eventually fell asleep on the couch, the TV still flickering in the background. In the other room, Sarah worked late into the night, oblivious to the growing chasm that threatened to consume their marriage. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the bedroom. Ethan blinked awake, disoriented for a moment before realizing he had fallen asleep on the couch. The TV was still on, now playing an early morning news show, but the sound was muted. He groaned as he stretched, feeling the stiffness in his back from sleeping in an awkward position. As he rubbed the sleep from his eyes, he glanced at the clock on the wall. It was just past 7 a.m. Sarah would already be up, getting ready for another long day at the office. Ethan pushed himself off the couch and headed to the kitchen, hoping to catch her before she left. He found Sarah standing by the kitchen counter, sipping a cup of coffee. She was dressed in another sharp business outfit, her hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. The tension in her shoulders was evident, and Ethan wondered if she had gotten any sleep at all. Morning, he said, trying to sound cheerful as he reached for a mug to pour himself some coffee. Morning, Sarah replied, her voice distant. Ethan could sense the weight of unspoken thoughts between them. He wanted to say something, anything, that would bridge the gap, but he didn't know where to start. Instead, he busied himself with his coffee, the silence stretching on uncomfortably. Tommy's still asleep, Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. Sarah nodded, staring into her cup. I hate that I don't get to see him in the mornings. You could try coming home earlier, Ethan suggested gently. Or maybe take a day off this week. We could spend some time together, just the three of us. Sarah hesitated, biting her lip. I don't know if I can, Ethan. This case with Michael Carter, it's huge. The firm is counting on me. I get that, Sarah, but we're counting on you too, Ethan said, his frustration slipping into his voice. Tommy and we need you here. Sarah set her cup down and turned to face him, her eyes filled with guilt. I know, Ethan. I know. And I hate that I'm not around as much as I should be. But this is important. It's my career. And what about our family? Ethan asked, his tone more pointed now. Isn't that important too? Of course it is. Sarah snapped, her emotions boiling over. But I can't just walk away from my responsibilities at work. You knew this when we got married, Ethan. You knew how much my career means to me. Ethan stared at her, the frustration and hurt building up inside him. I never asked you to walk away, Sarah. I just want you to find a balance. To make time for us. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. I'm trying, Ethan. I really am. But this case, it's going to take a lot out of me. I can't promise things will get better overnight. Ethan felt a pang of disappointment. He had hoped for more, hoped that she would see the toll her absence was taking on their family. But he also knew that pushing her too hard would only drive her further away. I understand, Ethan said, though the words felt hollow. Just don't forget about us, okay? Sarah's expression softened, and she stepped closer, placing a hand on his cheek. I won't, Ethan. I love you, and I love Tommy. I'm doing this for us too, you know. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. He leaned in and kissed her softly, hoping to convey the depth of his feelings, but the connection felt fragile, like it could shatter at any moment. I'll see you tonight, Sarah whispered, pulling away. Yeah, Ethan replied, watching as she grabbed her briefcase and headed for the door. As the door closed behind her, Ethan stood alone in the kitchen, the weight of their conversation pressing down on him. He wanted to believe that things would get better, that Sarah would find a way to balance her career and their family life. But deep down, he feared that their relationship was teetering on the edge, and it was only a matter of time before it crumbled completely. The day passed in a blur for Ethan. He went through the motions of his radio show, discussing the latest political scandals and fielding calls from listeners, but his heart wasn't in it. His mind kept drifting back to Sarah, to their strained conversation that morning, and to the growing sense of unease that gnawed at him. When he wrapped up his show and headed home, the apartment was eerily quiet. Tommy was at daycare, and Sarah wouldn't be home for hours. The silence was oppressive, and Ethan found himself pacing the living room, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, he grabbed his phone and dialed Sarah's number. It rang several times before going to voicemail. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He left a brief message, asking her to call him when she got a chance, but he wasn't sure if she would. Ethan spent the next few hours trying to distract himself. He worked out, watched TV, and even attempted to read a book, but nothing could hold his attention. He felt restless, like he was waiting for something to happen, even though he didn't know what it was. When Tommy finally came home, Ethan tried to push his worries aside and focus on his son. They played with Tommy's toy cars, built a fort out of pillows, and even baked cookies together. For a little while, Ethan managed to forget about the tension in his marriage and simply enjoy the time with his son. But as the evening wore on and Sarah still hadn't come home, the unease crept back in. Ethan fed Tommy dinner, gave him a bath, and put him to bed, all the while glancing at the clock and wondering where Sarah was. It wasn't until nearly 10 p.m. that Ethan heard the sound of the front door opening. Sarah walked in, looking exhausted but determined, her briefcase slung over her shoulder. You're late, Ethan said, trying to keep the accusation out of his voice. I know, Sarah replied, her voice weary. I'm sorry. The meeting ran long, and then I had to finish up some paperwork. You said you'd be home earlier, Ethan reminded her. I know, Sarah repeated, setting her briefcase down. But this case, it's just taking up so much time. I didn't expect it to be this intense. Ethan stared at her, his frustration mounting. And what about us, Sarah? What about Tommy? You promised you'd make time for us, but it feels like you're slipping back into old habits. Sarah looked down, her shoulders slumping. I don't want to fight, Ethan. I'm doing the best I can. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to calm the anger that was bubbling up inside him. I'm not trying to fight either, Sarah. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. It feels like we're living separate lives. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she stepped closer, reaching for his hand. Ethan, please. I'm trying to make this work. I love you, and I love Tommy. But this job, it's who I am. I can't just walk away from it. Ethan squeezed her hand, his heart aching. I don't want you to walk away, Sarah. I just want you to be here, with us. I want us to be a family. Sarah nodded, wiping away a tear. We are a family, Ethan. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure we stay that way. Ethan pulled her into a hug, holding her close as she cried softly against his shoulder. He wanted to believe that they could make it through this, that they could find a way to balance their lives and rebuild their relationship. But as he held her, he couldn't shake the nagging fear that their fragile hopes might not be enough. As the night wore on, Ethan and Sarah talked quietly about their future, about the challenges they faced and the compromises they needed to make. They both knew it wouldn't be easy, but they were determined to try. When they finally went to bed, Ethan lay awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the future held for them. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but for the sake of their family, he was willing to fight for it. But even as he drifted off to sleep, a part of him couldn't help but wonder if they were already too late. Ethan knew something was wrong long before he had any proof. It was a gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach, a sense that things were slipping further out of his control. Sarah had always been dedicated to her work, but lately, her absences had grown longer, her excuses thinner, and her mood more distant. Ethan tried to push the thoughts away, tried to focus on the life they had built together, but the doubts lingered, festering like an open wound. One evening, after another long day at the studio, Ethan decided to stop by the cigar lounge in downtown Chicago, a place where he often went to unwind. The lounge was a refuge for him, a quiet space where he could relax with a drink and a good cigar, away from the pressures of his work and the tension at home. But even as he settled into one of the plush leather chairs, the worries about Sarah followed him, a dark cloud he couldn't escape. He lit a cigar and took a deep drag, savoring the rich, smoky flavor. The familiar routine brought him a measure of comfort, but his mind kept drifting back to Sarah. He wondered if she was still at the office, buried under a mountain of paperwork, or if she had already gone home to an empty apartment. He didn't want to think about the alternative, but the possibility loomed large in his mind. As he sat there, nursing his drink, a familiar face caught his eye. Emma Roberts, a journalist he had worked with on several occasions, walked into the lounge. She was dressed in a sleek, professional outfit, her red hair cascading over her shoulders. She spotted Ethan and made her way over, a friendly smile on her lips. "Ethan, fancy seeing you here," Emma said as she approached. "Emma," Ethan replied, forcing a smile. "What brings you to this part of town?" "Just finished a meeting nearby and thought I'd stop in for a drink," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "You? Needed a break," Ethan said, taking another drag from his cigar. "It's been a long day." "I hear you," Emma said, waving over a waiter to order a glass of wine. "I've been swamped with work myself. The news never stops, does it?" Ethan chuckled, though it felt forced. "No, it doesn't." They made small talk for a while, discussing the latest headlines and sharing stories from their respective jobs. But as the conversation continued, Ethan noticed that Emma seemed distracted, her gaze flickering to her phone every few minutes. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she set her glass down and leaned forward, her expression serious. "Ethan, there's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice low. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Emma hesitated, as if searching for the right words. "I wasn't sure if I should say anything, but I thought you should know. I've been hearing things about Sarah." Ethan's grip tightened around his glass. "What kind of things?" Emma took a deep breath. "You know she's working on that case with Michael Carter, right?" "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice tense. "What about it?" "Well, there's been talk," Emma said carefully. "Rumors that she's been spending a lot of time with Carter. More time than necessary for the case." Ethan's stomach churned. "Rumors? From who?" "Sources close to Carter's team," Emma said. "I can't say for sure, but it's not just professional, Ethan. People are saying there's something more going on between them." Ethan felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. He stared at Emma, his mind racing. He wanted to deny it, to brush it off as just gossip, but the doubts that had been eating away at him for weeks suddenly felt all too real. Are you sure? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. I have something else. I wasn't going to show you, but I think you deserve to know. She handed him the phone, and Ethan took it with trembling hands. On the screen was a video, grainy but clear enough to make out the figures. It showed Sarah and Michael Carter in what appeared to be an office, standing close together. Too close. The video played on, and Ethan watched in horror as Michael leaned in and kissed Sarah. She didn't pull away. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, each beat like a hammer blow. He felt sick, his entire world spinning out of control. The video ended, and he handed the phone back to Emma, unable to look at her. I'm so sorry, Ethan, Emma said, her voice full of sympathy. I didn't want to be the one to tell you, but I thought it was better coming from me than from someone else. Ethan couldn't speak. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, anger, betrayal, heartbreak. He had suspected something was wrong, but seeing it confirmed in that video was more than he could bear. Do you want to talk about it? Emma asked gently. Ethan shook his head, his throat tight. I need some air. He stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his drink in the process. He made his way to the door, ignoring the concerned looks from the other patrons. As soon as he was outside, he sucked in a deep breath, trying to steady himself. But the cold night air did little to calm the storm raging inside him. He wandered down the street, his mind a blur. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to get away, to escape the crushing weight of what he had just seen. He thought of Tommy, his sweet, innocent son, and the life they had built together. It felt like it was all slipping through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Ethan walked for what felt like hours, lost in his thoughts. Eventually, he found himself at the edge of a small park, the city lights twinkling in the distance. He sank onto a bench, burying his face in his hands. The pain was overwhelming, a suffocating pressure that threatened to crush him. He had always known that Sarah's career was important to her, but he had never imagined it would lead to this. He had trusted her, loved her, and now that trust had been shattered beyond repair. The betrayal cut deep, a wound that he knew would never fully heal. Ethan sat there for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones, but he barely felt it. His mind was a whirlwind of memories, moments from their marriage, from the early days of their relationship when they had been so in love, to the more recent years of tension and distance. He had thought they could make it work, that they could find a way to balance their lives and rebuild what they had lost. But now, all of that seemed like a distant dream. As the hours passed, Ethan finally forced himself to stand. He couldn't stay here forever, lost in his own despair. He had to face reality, to confront what had happened and figure out what to do next. But as he walked back to his apartment, the weight of the betrayal hung heavy on his shoulders, and he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan barely remembered the walk back to his apartment. His mind was numb, as if it was trying to protect him from the raw pain that threatened to overwhelm him. When he finally reached the front door, he hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He wasn't sure what he was about to walk into, whether Sarah would be home, whether she would have some kind of explanation, or whether it would all just come crashing down around him. He turned the knob and stepped inside. The apartment was dark and quiet, save for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Ethan glanced around, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. There was no sign of Sarah, no sign that she had even been home. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and quietly shut the door behind him. For a moment, he just stood there, leaning against the door as if he could somehow hold back the flood of emotions that were threatening to break through. The betrayal felt like a physical weight pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. He needed to get a grip on himself, to figure out what to do next, but his mind kept circling back to the image of Sarah and Michael in that video. Eventually, Ethan pushed himself away from the door and headed to the kitchen. He needed a drink, something to dull the sharp edges of his thoughts. He reached for the bottle of whiskey on the counter and poured himself a generous glass. The amber liquid caught the light as he stared at it, trying to find some kind of solace at the bottom of the glass. He took a long sip, feeling the burn as the whiskey slid down his throat. It didn't help. If anything, it only made the pain more acute, stripping away the numbness and leaving him raw and exposed. He set the glass down with a shaky hand and pressed his palms against the counter, trying to steady himself. His thoughts turned to Tommy, asleep in his room, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing just outside his door. Ethan couldn't bear the thought of his son getting caught in the crossfire of this mess. He had to protect him, to shield him from the fallout of Sarah's betrayal. But how could he do that when his own world was falling apart? As he stood there, lost in thought, Ethan heard the sound of the front door opening. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned to see Sarah walking in. She looked tired, her hair slightly disheveled, but there was a determined set to her jaw that Ethan recognized all too well. She shut the door quietly behind her and paused when she saw him standing in the kitchen. "Ethan," she said softly, as if she had expected him to be asleep. "Sarah," Ethan replied, his voice strained. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over to him. "I didn't expect you to be up." "I couldn't sleep," Ethan said, his eyes narrowing. "Where have you been?" Sarah glanced away, avoiding his gaze. "I had to stay late at the office. There was a lot of work to get through." Ethan felt a surge of anger, the emotions he had been trying to hold back finally breaking free. "Is that what you call it? Work?" Sarah looked up, her expression confused. "What do you mean?" Ethan clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. "Don't play dumb, Sarah. I know." She stared at him, her eyes widening in realization. "Ethan, I know about you and Michael Carter," Ethan interrupted, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "I saw the video." Sarah's face drained of color. For a moment, she just stood there, as if frozen in place. Then she shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Ethan, save it," Ethan snapped, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't want to hear how you're sorry, or how it didn't mean anything, or how you're going to change. Because I don't believe you, Sarah. Not anymore." Sarah's tears spilled over, running down her cheeks. "Ethan, please. It was a mistake. I wasn't thinking." "No," Ethan said, his voice cold. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You chose your career over our family, over me, and now you've thrown it all away for what? For him?" Sarah shook her head frantically, as if she could somehow undo the damage that had been done. "No, Ethan, it's not like that. I love you. I love our family. This was a horrible mistake, but it doesn't change how I feel about you." Ethan laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and unforgiving. "Love? You call this love? You've been lying to me, sneaking around behind my back, and now you expect me to just forgive you?" "I don't expect you to forgive me," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "I know I messed up, but I'm begging you, Ethan. Don't throw everything away because of this. We can work through it. We can fix this." Ethan stared at her, his anger giving way to a deep, aching sadness. "I don't know if we can, Sarah. I don't know if there's anything left to fix." Sarah took a step closer, reaching out to him. "Ethan, please. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I'll quit my job, I'll go to counseling, I'll do anything. Just don't give up on us." Ethan looked at her, seeing the desperation in her eyes, the raw emotion that mirrored his own. For a moment, he wavered, his resolve weakening. He had loved Sarah once, loved her more than anything, and part of him still did. But the betrayal had cut too deep, leaving a wound that he wasn't sure could ever heal. He took a step back, shaking his head. "I can't, Sarah. I can't just pretend that this didn't happen. You made your choice, and now we have to live with the consequences." Sarah's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her. She looked down, her tears falling silently onto the kitchen floor. "What are you going to do?" Ethan swallowed hard, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "I'm filing for divorce." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with shock. "Ethan, no. Please, don't do this. We can find a way to make this work." Ethan shook his head again, his heart breaking all over again as he saw the pain in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Sarah, but I can't stay in a marriage built on lies and betrayal. I have to think about Tommy. I have to think about what's best for him. Sarah's tears flowed freely now, her body trembling with the force of her sobs. Ethan, please, don't do this to us. Don't take Tommy away from me. Ethan closed his eyes, the agony of the decision tearing him apart. I don't want to, Sarah. But I can't stay. Not after this. For a long moment, they just stood there, the silence between them broken only by Sarah's quiet sobs. Ethan felt like he was being torn in two, the love he had once felt for Sarah clashing with the anger and hurt that had consumed him. Finally, Sarah wiped at her tears, her voice small and defeated. If that's what you really want, Ethan, then I won't fight you. But please, let's do this in a way that's best for Tommy. He deserves that much. Ethan nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He turned away from her, unable to bear the sight of her broken expression any longer. He walked out of the kitchen, his footsteps echoing in the empty apartment. As he reached the door to Tommy's room, he paused, his hand resting on the doorknob. He opened the door quietly and stepped inside. Tommy was sound asleep in his crib, his little chest rising and falling with each breath. Ethan felt a lump form in his throat as he watched his son, the innocence and purity of the boy starkly contrasting with the turmoil that had taken over his own life. Ethan leaned down and gently kissed Tommy's forehead, his heart aching with love for his son. He knew that whatever happened, he would do everything in his power to protect Tommy, to give him the life he deserved. As Ethan left the room and closed the door behind him, he felt a sense of finality settle over him. The marriage he had once believed in, the life he had envisioned with Sarah, was over. There was no going back. He walked to the bedroom he had shared with Sarah, the memories of their life together flooding his mind. He knew he had to start packing, to begin the process of separating their lives, but the weight of it all was too much. Instead, he sat down on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. The tears he had been holding back finally spilled over, and he wept, the pain of the betrayal crashing over him like a tidal wave. It was in that moment, as the tears fell, that Ethan realized just how much he had lost. The woman he had loved, the life they had built together, the future they had dreamed of. It was all gone, shattered by a single act of betrayal. And as Ethan sat there, alone in the darkness, he wondered if he would ever be whole again. The weeks that followed were a blur for Ethan. The decision to file for divorce had been final, but the process was anything but simple. There were meetings with lawyers, discussions about custody arrangements, and endless paperwork that only served to remind him of the life he was leaving behind. Each signature felt like a nail in the coffin of his marriage, a painful acknowledgement that the life he had known was over. Sarah moved out of their apartment shortly after Ethan filed the divorce papers. She found a place not too far away, so she could still be close to Tommy, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. Their interactions became cold and formal, reduced to brief exchanges about their son and the logistics of co-parenting. The warmth, the connection they had once shared, was gone. Ethan tried to keep things as normal as possible for Tommy. He stuck to their routines, made sure Tommy was always the center of his attention, and did his best to shield him from the turmoil that had engulfed their lives. But even at his young age, Tommy could sense that something was wrong. He asked about his mommy, about why she wasn't coming home, and Ethan struggled to find the right words to explain the situation. "It's complicated, buddy," Ethan would say, his heart breaking a little more each time. "But mommy and daddy both love you very much, and that will never change." Tommy would nod, his big eyes searching Ethan's face for answers he couldn't give. It was in those moments that Ethan felt the weight of his decision the heaviest. He knew he had done what was best for him and Tommy, but it didn't make the pain any easier to bear. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan slowly began to adjust to his new reality. He threw himself into his work, using it as a distraction from the pain. His radio show became his refuge, a place where he could focus on something other than the dissolution of his marriage. But even there, the shadow of what had happened loomed over him, and his listeners could sense it. The calls he received were more supportive, more empathetic, and though Ethan appreciated it, he couldn't help but feel exposed. Outside of work, Ethan found himself leaning on the few friends he could trust. He spent more time with Nick, the owner of the cigar lounge, who offered a listening ear and a steady supply of scotch. Nick never pushed for details, understanding that some wounds needed time to heal. Instead, he simply offered companionship, a quiet presence that helped Ethan feel less alone. One person who became a surprising source of support was Emma Roberts. After the night she had shown Ethan the video, she had reached out a few times, checking in on him. At first, Ethan had been hesitant to respond, feeling too raw to engage with anyone who had witnessed his pain so intimately. But Emma was persistent, her messages always kind and understanding, and eventually, Ethan found himself replying. They started meeting for coffee or drinks, sometimes just to talk, other times to sit in comfortable silence. Emma had been through her own share of heartbreak, and though their situations were different, there was a mutual understanding between them. She didn't try to fix him or offer platitudes, she simply listened, and in doing so, she gave Ethan a space to process his feelings. One evening, a few months after the divorce papers had been filed, Ethan found himself sitting across from Emma at a small Italian restaurant. It was a cozy place, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city, and they had fallen into the habit of coming here whenever they needed to escape the noise of their lives. "You're looking better," Emma said as she sipped her wine. "I mean, not that you looked bad before, but you seem lighter." Ethan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I guess I'm just getting used to it. To the new normal." Emma nodded, her gaze soft. "It's a process. It's okay to take your time." Ethan leaned back in his chair, looking around the restaurant. The dim lighting, the soft music playing in the background, the clinking of glasses and murmurs of conversation, it all felt strangely comforting. For a moment, he allowed himself to just be present, to enjoy the simple pleasure of good food and good company. "Thank you," Ethan said after a while, his voice quiet. "For what?" Emma asked, tilting her head. "For being here," Ethan replied. "For not giving up on me." Emma smiled, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I'm not going anywhere, Ethan. You're not as alone as you think." Ethan squeezed her hand, feeling a warmth spread through him that he hadn't felt in a long time. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he was grateful for the people who had stood by him, who had helped him navigate the darkest period of his life. As the evening wore on, their conversation drifted to lighter topics: work, mutual friends, plans for the weekend. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he could breathe, like the weight on his chest was starting to lift. When they left the restaurant, the cool night air greeted them, a stark contrast to the warmth inside. They walked together for a while, the city lights casting a soft glow around them. Emma slipped her arm through Ethan's, and he didn't pull away. It felt nice, natural, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility of something more. But he wasn't ready to jump into anything new. He still had a lot of healing to do, and he didn't want to make the same mistakes again. As they walked, Ethan found himself opening up to Emma about his fears, his doubts, the things he had been keeping to himself. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready for another relationship," Ethan admitted as they reached the corner of a quiet street. "It's like, part of me is still stuck in the past, in what happened with Sarah." Emma nodded, her expression understanding. "It's normal to feel that way. You went through something incredibly painful, and it's going to take time to move on. But you don't have to do it alone." Ethan looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. He felt a flicker of something, hope, maybe, that he hadn't felt in a long time. He smiled, a real smile this time, and nodded. "Yeah, I know." They stood there for a moment, the city bustling around them, but it felt like they were in their own little world. Ethan felt a sense of peace wash over him, a calm he hadn't experienced in months. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. As they said good night and went their separate ways, Ethan walked back to his apartment with a lighter heart. The road ahead was still uncertain, but he was ready to face it, one step at a time. The next few weeks were a turning point for Ethan. He focused on rebuilding his life, piece by piece, starting with his relationship with Tommy. He made a conscious effort to be more present, to spend as much time as possible with his son. They went to the park, played games, and shared meals together. Ethan wanted Tommy to know that, no matter what, he was loved and cared for. Ethan also started making changes at work. He cut back on his hours, delegating more responsibilities to his team so that he could have a better work-life balance. His producer, Jenny, noticed the difference almost immediately. "You seem different," Jenny remarked one day as they were preparing for a show. "In a good way." Ethan smiled, adjusting his headphones. "I guess I'm just trying to focus on what really matters." Jenny nodded, giving him a knowing look. "That's good. We've all been worried about you." Ethan appreciated her concern, but he didn't want to dwell on the past. He was determined to look forward, to build a new life for himself and Tommy. The divorce was finalized a few months later. It was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, it marked the official end of his marriage, but on the other, it was a chance to start fresh. Ethan knew that he and Sarah would always be connected through Tommy, but their lives were now on separate paths. Sarah had taken the news hard. She had tried to make amends, to repair the damage she had caused, but in the end, it hadn't been enough. Ethan had reached a point where he couldn't look back, where he couldn't ignore the betrayal that had shattered his trust. They had agreed on joint custody, with Tommy spending time with both parents, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing something precious. Still, he knew it was the right decision. He couldn't build a future on a foundation of lies, and as much as it hurt, he had to let go of the past. As the months went by, Ethan continued to grow and heal. He spent more time with friends, rekindled old hobbies, and even started dating again. It was a slow process, filled with awkward first dates and moments of uncertainty, but it was also a reminder that life went on, that there was still hope for the future. Through it all, Emma remained a constant presence in his life. Their friendship deepened, and while there were moments of flirtation and the possibility of something more, they both agreed to take things slow. Neither of them wanted to rush into anything, and they valued the connection they had built. One evening, as they sat on Ethan's balcony, watching the sun set over the city, Emma turned to him and said, "You've come a long way, Ethan. I'm proud of you." Ethan smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. "I couldn't have done it without you." Emma shook her head, her eyes shining with affection. "You're stronger than you think. You just needed to believe in yourself." Ethan looked at her, seeing the woman who had stood by him through his darkest days, who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. He felt a surge of gratitude, and for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he could be happy again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a warm, golden glow, Ethan reached for Emma's hand. She smiled at him, her fingers intertwining with his, and in that moment, Ethan knew that he was finally ready to move on. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges along the way, but Ethan was no longer afraid. He had survived the storm, and now, he was ready to embrace the dawn of a new beginning. As we wrap up this emotional journey through The Shattered Trust, a story of a cheating wife and a family's journey to healing, we've seen how Ethan Harris faced the ultimate betrayal and found the strength to rebuild his life. This story is a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the power of forgiveness, not just towards others but towards oneself. Remember, healing takes time, and while the road may be long and filled with challenges, there is always hope on the other side. Thank you for joining us today. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and inspire the soul.